In the depths of winter, February of 1856, the small frontier settlement of Cedar Mills, Ohio, lay buried beneath snowdrifts that turned the dirt roads into frozen corridors of silence. The town, scarcely 300 souls strong, seemed almost forgotten by the rest of the nation. A handful of crude houses, a blacksmith shop, a general store, and a modest brick meeting house where the local Quaker community gathered. To passers-by, Cedar Mills looked ordinary, even dull. Yet, beneath its plain surface pulsed a dangerous secret. This quiet place was a vital artery of the Underground Railroad. On the night of February 23rd, as frost clawed at the windows and the wind howled through the bare trees, events unfolded in Cedar Mills that would alter the course of whispered history. In a hidden basement beneath the Quaker meeting house, a young woman named Ruth went into labor. She was 19, worn from the hardships of flight, and her swollen belly betrayed that her journey north had ended in more than desperation. It had ended in a birth none could have foreseen. The midwife that night, Martha Whitmore, wife of Elder Samuel, later wrote in her private journal that the atmosphere inside the basement felt heavy with more than the air of childbirth. It was as if shadows themselves leaned close to listen. Ruth had been taken in days earlier, arriving alone after slipping past slave catchers along the Ohio River. She gave little of her history, only that she had fled from northern Kentucky. Yet those who spent time with her noticed something uncanny. She seemed to know things without being told. She rejected food that later turned out spoiled. She sensed visitors long before they knocked, and she caught lies with unsettling certainty. Now, beneath a flickering candle, Ruth lay on a straw mattress as the first contraction seized her. The meeting house above was not empty. Samuel and others were sheltering several freedom seekers, while the distant sound of hounds on the wind confirmed that bounty hunters were near. Yet all focus shifted to Ruth. Her breathing was calm, unnaturally calm. There was no thrashing, no screams, only stillness, as though she were listening for a signal the others could not hear. When Martha leaned close and asked how many children she carried, Ruth's eyes opened, catching the candlelight with an eerie glow. 3, she whispered. 3 sons. They have been waiting for tonight. Martha felt a chill despite the heat of the small fire. Triplets were rare, dangerous even in the best conditions, and never had she delivered such a birth under the looming threat of discovery. Above them, Samuel kept watch. Reports spoke of the Garrett brothers, notorious slave hunters, prowling the county with bloodhounds and informants. If the meeting house were searched that night, the lives of everyone inside freedom seekers, Quakers, and this trembling mother would be forfeit. Labor advanced with unearthly speed. Ruth did not moan or cry. She was silent, her body strangely obedient to forces unknown. The first boy entered the world in utter quiet, no cry, no gasping for air. His eyes opened immediately, dark and unblinking, fixed on Martha as though already aware. Before the cord could be cut, the second child slipped free, also silent, also watching. Then the third delivered as swiftly as the others. Martha, who had assisted dozens of births, later confessed it was the most unnatural natural birth I ever beheld. 3 infants, each as calm as the grave, and yet alive beyond doubt. At that precise moment, heavy boots thudded across the floor above. Voices angry, searching, echoed in the timbers. The Garretts had arrived. Dogs barked furiously outside. One man even stood upon the trapdoor concealing the basement. Martha froze, clutching the newborns, praying they would not betray their presence. But the infants did not whimper, not even a breath louder than the mother's own. They lay in Ruth's arms, with an awareness no newborn should possess, their gaze moving in unison toward the sound of the searchers above. For 3 hours the hunters prowled. They overturned benches, rifled through closets, and cursed their informants. The dogs scratched at floorboards, noses quivering inches from the hidden trapdoor. Yet never did the infants cry. Never did they reveal themselves. It was as though they knew silence was survival. Finally, when hoofbeats faded into the distance, the three boys wailed together for the first time, one voice split in three bodies, a haunting chorus that chilled even the faithful Quakers who had witnessed it. And then Ruth, pale and trembling, bled beyond saving. Her final words to Martha were whispered through cracked lips. They will always know. They are not like other children. Guard them, but remember what they are. Moments later, she was gone. Above, the Quaker men returned, weary but safe. 7 freedom seekers had already fled into the snowy woods. Yet Samuel Whitmore knew the community now bore a burden heavier than any before. They had not simply sheltered the oppressed, they had witnessed a birth that defied the order of creation itself. Ruth's body was laid in the Meeting House Cemetery, but her children, 3 nameless infants, remained. No record of their birth could be made, for the law would condemn them as property, fatherless, unclaimed. And so Samuel convened the elders. After long silence, they agreed the community would raise the boys as their own. They would rotate homes, shared responsibility, and guard the secret. The children were named in the Quaker tradition Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac. From the first days of their lives, they were different. When one stirred, the others stirred. When one turned his head, the others followed, as if moved by invisible strings. Martha noted every detail. Her journal, later hidden in an attic chest. The infants displayed unnerving awareness. Their gaze followed doorways where no figure stood until, minutes later, someone troubled or deceitful appeared. They recoiled from visitors who lied. They never tolerated dishonesty, not even in jest. Thus began a story that would ripple through generations. 3 children, born in silence, carrying with them an inheritance beyond human comprehension. The Quakers did not yet know that these boys would shape the fate of their community, their nation, and perhaps the course of human evolution itself. For now, they were only infants. But already, whispers began. These are not children, as we know them, they are something else entirely. The town of Cedar Mills in 1856 was little more than a cluster of weather-beaten structures along a frozen road. Its survival tethered to faith, routine, and suspicion of outsiders. Its lifeblood flowed not through commerce but through conviction. For the Quaker community, faith was simplicity, silence, and equality before God. But hidden beneath their plain garments and gentle voices lay a defiance that could end their lives. They were participants in one of the most perilous networks in American history, the Underground Railroad. The meeting house of Cedar Mills looked modest, even austere, a squat brick structure without ornament. Its benches plain wood, its windows unadorned. But the building was not what it seemed. Beneath the pulpit lay a trap door concealed under planks worn smooth by years of sermons. That door opened into a secret chamber dug painstakingly by hand, reinforced with timber beams and ventilated through hollow fence posts disguised as decoration. There, freedom seekers, men, women, and children waited in silence for the chance to flee north toward the promise of liberty. The danger was constant. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 had given bounty hunters unchecked power, turning every sympathetic home into a target. Ohio, though technically a free state, had become hunting ground. Slave catchers roamed with impunity, often crossing entire counties in search of informants. The most notorious among them were the Garrett brothers, whose packs of bloodhounds and willingness to bribe neighbors spread fear wherever they roamed. Their reputation was not merely one of brutality, but of cunning. Many whispered that the Garretts had a network of spies, former slaves forced into betrayal, willing to trade the lives of the desperate for their own survival. Against this backdrop of terror, the Quakers persisted. Elder Samuel Whitmore. Their de facto leader was both farmer and sentinel. His hands were scarred from decades tilling soil, but his eyes, steel gray and unyielding, watched with the quiet vigilance of one who knew discovery meant ruin. For 8 years he had overseen the Cedar Mills station, ferrying hundreds northward through tunnels and thickets. Yet never before had he faced such strain. The winter of 1856 pressed harder than most. Patrols increased. Rumors of betrayal circulated. Each knock upon the meeting-house door sent a shiver through the congregation. It was into this crucible of fear that Ruth had entered days before her labor began. She claimed no surname. When asked, she said simply, "Call me Ruth." Her arrival had unsettled the community more than most. She was alone, visibly pregnant. And unlike many who passed through, she spoke with a peculiar clarity. Her words carried education uncommon among the enslaved. More troubling was her uncanny sense of foresight. On her second evening, she told Martha that the man delivering supplies was lying about his name. Days later, the man was exposed as an informant. The Quakers, who had built their lives upon faith, suddenly found themselves in the company of someone whose knowledge seemed to bypass faith entirely. Was Ruth blessed, cursed, chosen? No one dared ask aloud. When her labor came upon her, fear and secrecy closed in from all directions. Above ground, Samuel prepared the hidden northern tunnel in case the meeting house had to be abandoned. Underground, Martha and her daughter Rebecca attended Ruth in a dim glow of tallow candles. The chamber was tight, barely large enough for those inside, its air thick with the damp earth. Yet Ruth's demeanor remained unnervingly calm. The Garrett brothers drew closer that night. The signal of approaching riders came from a man named Joshua, a freedom seeker who burst through the front door with lungs full of panic. "They are coming," he gasped. "They know. They've got dogs." His eyes darted toward the basement. Panic rippled through Samuel's chest. In all his years, no threat had ever come so near. Yet below, Ruth's silence deepened. She seemed already beyond earthly fear. The triplets came one after another, silent as death, while the searchers' boots clattered above. 3 children born beneath wood and soil, their cries withheld as though by design. To the Quakers huddled in prayer, it seemed divine intervention. To Martha, who held them first, it felt more like an intrusion of something otherworldly into their fragile human world. When the bounty hunters departed, empty-handed, leaving curses on the frozen wind, the congregation gathered above to debate what should be done. 3 infants without father, without records, without claim. The law did not recognize their humanity, and to reveal their birth would invite ruin. Yet to abandon them was unthinkable. Samuel argued, if we can harbor men and women fleeing chains, surely we can harbor babes who had no choice in their birth. His words silenced the room. Thus it was decided. The children would belong to all of Cedar Mills. Each family would rotate their care, sharing the burden and the secret alike. The Quakers believed themselves ready. They had harbored fugitives, stared down hunters, risked imprisonment. But they had not yet reckoned with what it meant to raise children who were not like other children. In the weeks following their mother's death, the infants grew steadily. They nursed, they slept, they opened their dark eyes wide. Yet what disturbed Martha was the synchrony. They turned their heads at the same instant, fixed their eyes on the same corner, whimpered in unison as though responding to an unseen voice. At first she thought it coincidence, but coincidences repeated with such precision began to feel like design. When visitors arrived, the boys' behavior became more troubling still. If someone entered the room with joy or honesty, the children cooed and reached their tiny hands. But when deception walked through the door, the infants stiffened, their eyes clouding with agitation. Once, when a traveler concealed his name, all three turned their heads away at the exact same moment, refusing to look at him. The man left uneasy, and later was discovered to have been a spy for the bounty hunters. The Quakers whispered among themselves that these were the children of knowing. Some saw it as divine gift, a shield against betrayal. Others feared it as a curse, a mark that might bring ruin upon them. The Garrett brothers still prowled the region, and each week brought rumors of captures. Yet no one betrayed the infants. Their presence, though strange, bound the community together in secrecy deeper than any they had ever kept. Still, unease grew. What had Ruth been? How had she known so much in life? And what had she passed into her sons? The triplets were not yet walking, yet already the air around them seemed charged, as though unseen forces moved with their breath. The faithful of Cedar Mills carried on their duties, but always beneath their prayers lingered the same question: what, exactly, had been born among them that winter night? By the spring of 1856, the town of Cedar Mills had grown used to harboring fugitives. But they had not grown used to Ruth's sons, Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac. The three names chosen in quiet meeting were unlike any children Martha Whitmore had ever nursed. At first, the signs were subtle, the way they stirred in unison when no sound was made, or how their eyes turned towards empty doorways as though they sensed what was to come. Martha began keeping notes, fearing she might lose her sanity if she did not record what she witnessed. At 6 months, she wrote, the boys lifted their heads all at once, their gaze fixed upon the window. There was nothing outside, not even a bird. Yet they stared, silent, until a man approached the house minutes later. His heart was heavy, I could see it in his face. And when he entered, the boys wailed until he confessed the death of his brother. This was not an isolated incident. Time and again, the triplets showed awareness beyond reason. If someone lied even about something trivial, they turned away, refusing to meet the speaker's eyes. If a stranger carried falsehood, the boys stiffened, their bodies rigid, their tiny fists clenched. At first, the adults laughed nervously, calling them clever babies. But by the time the boys reached their first birthday, laughter gave way to unease. They were not simply reacting, they were discerning. The community whispered that Ruth had foreseen it. Her last words, they will always know, echoed in every heart. Yet none dared speak of it beyond trusted walls. Cedar Mills was already a marked town, watched by hunters and threatened by informants. To admit that 3 orphaned children could pierce the veil of deceit was to risk more than exposure. It was to risk the charge of witchcraft, heresy, or madness. Still, stories spread quietly. Freedom seekers who passed through told of the children. Some swore that their presence felt like standing before a judge who saw directly into one's heart. Word traveled faster than Samuel Whitmore liked, and soon the Cedar Mills station became a place not only of refuge, but of whispered awe. Conductors requested passage there, convinced the boys could detect infiltrators. If the infants are calm, one man said, we know the company is safe. If they are restless, danger walks among us. And indeed, danger did. In late 1857, a peddler named Thompson arrived at the meeting house claiming to be bound for Columbus. He smiled, spoke politely, and carried wares of good quality. Yet, the moment he entered, the triplets grew agitated, refusing to eat or sleep. They wailed until Samuel asked the man to depart. Weeks later, news arrived. Thompson had been arrested for murdering his partner, concealing the body in his wagon at the very time he visited Cedar Mills. The children had known. But such abilities came at a price. By their 2nd year, the boys grew increasingly isolated. Other children avoided them, unsettled by their unblinking stares and whispered conversations in a language no one could decipher. It was the same fluid tongue Ruth had spoken in the basement, a cadence like water flowing over stone. They used it only among themselves, heads tilted close, words soft and secret. Adults who overheard shuddered, unable to tell if it was gibberish or something far older. Martha noted when they speak so, they seem less like children than old men conspiring. Their eyes grow dark, and they glance at us with pity, as though they know something we cannot. Dr. William Harrison, the local physician, visited often. He was fascinated by the boys, though unsettled. He examined their sight, their hearing, their reflexes all normal. Yet he could not deny what he saw. They perceived truth and falsehood as surely as we perceive light and shadow. He wrote to a colleague in Cincinnati, "I cannot say whether this is gift or affliction, but I confess it leaves me uneasy." By 1859, their role within the Underground Railroad had grown undeniable. 7 infiltrators were exposed because of them, saving countless lives. When strangers arrived, Samuel looked to the boys. If they remained calm, the fugitives were sheltered. If they recoiled, precautions were taken. Trust shifted from prayer to the silent judgment of 3 children. But as the boys' influence deepened, so did unease. Adults began to wonder, what did the boys see when they looked at them? Every lie, every hidden thought, every unspoken bitterness were these laid bare to the triplets as easily as words on a page. Men and women who prided themselves on honesty still felt their cheeks burn beneath the children's gaze. They judged without speaking. One elder whispered, "Even the righteous feel naked before them." The triplets themselves seemed aware of the discomfort they caused. By their 4th year, they learned to temper their stares, to whisper only when alone. Yet this self-control only widened the gulf between them and others. They were no longer ordinary children, they were watchers, bearers of knowledge too heavy for their small frames. The decisive moment came in January of 1860. Snow fell heavy upon the town when the boys suddenly began to cry in unison, a sound unlike any heard before. It was not the wail of hunger or pain, but something deeper, a keening lament that lasted 6 hours without pause. Martha tried milk, warmth, hymns, but nothing eased them. When they fell silent at last, the room felt drained, as if life itself had seeped from the walls. 2 days later, word arrived a group of 11 freedom seekers had been captured 40 miles south. Among them was a pregnant woman who gave birth during the pursuit. Both she and her child perished in the cold. The time of the capture matched the hours of the boys' distress exactly. Samuel dismissed it as coincidence until it happened again, and again. Each time the boys' grief aligned with betrayal, capture, or murder along the routes of escape. They were not merely judges of those before them. They were witnesses to suffering miles away. The people of Cedar Mills no longer whispered of the boys with curiosity. They spoke with reverence and with fear. For if they could feel sorrow at such distance, what else might they come to know, and what would it cost them and those around them if their power grew? The night of February 23rd. 1856 was remembered in Cedar Mills not only for the arrival of the Garrett brothers, but for the way 3 infants entered the world in silence and changed everything the Quakers thought they knew about God, truth, and human nature. Ruth, their mother, was buried within hours of their birth beneath a modest headstone in the frozen earth of the Quaker cemetery. Her final words, "They will always know," became both a warning and a prophecy that would echo for decades. The 3 boys, Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac, remained. They had no legal father, no documentation, no claim under law. In the eyes of the nation, they were nothing more than the children of a fugitive, destined for chains or anonymity. But Samuel Whitmore, burdened with responsibility, decreed that they would be raised by the community itself. The Quakers agreed reluctantly, for while they had risked their lives to shelter the enslaved, raising 3 extraordinary orphans was a task altogether different. The first year of their lives passed under the watchful eyes of Martha Whitmore, who acted as their guardian. She recorded in her journal what others dismissed as coincidence their strange synchrony, their awareness of deception, their tendency to grow silent whenever danger drew near. It is as though, she wrote, they live in one body with 3 faces. Each breath is shared, each thought carried between them, though no word is spoken. The most unsettling incident of that first year occurred on a Sunday morning during silent worship. The congregation sat in stillness, waiting upon the Spirit. When the door opened and a man entered late, he introduced himself as John Carter, a traveler from Lancaster seeking refuge. Yet, before Samuel could welcome him, the triplets, only 9 months old, turned their heads sharply toward him and began to wail, not in hunger but in fury. Their cries pierced the silence until the man, visibly shaken, excused himself and left. Weeks later, word arrived that Carter was not from Lancaster at all, but a paid informant working with the Garrett brothers. To the Quakers, this incident confirmed what they already feared: the boys were not ordinary. They could sense truth and falsehood in ways no scripture had promised. For Samuel, it was both blessing and burden. "We have been given guardians in the form of children," he wrote in a private letter, "but I tremble at what such a gift may cost us." When Ruth died, the manner of her death weighed heavily on Martha. Childbirth was perilous in the 19th century, yet Ruth's passing seemed almost foreordained. She had delivered her sons without pain, in silence, her gaze fixed on something unseen. She bled to death moments after whispering her prophecy. Some believed the unusual chemicals from southern plantations, dyes, poisons, and tonics used upon fields had poisoned her blood and altered her children. Others believed the truth more ancient, that Ruth had been touched by a gift not of this world. Whispers circulated in the Quaker community. Was this new life a divine intervention meant to protect fugitives, or had something unnatural slipped into the world beneath their meeting house? As the boys grew into toddlers, their difference became undeniable. At 1 year of age, they showed little interest in toys, yet immense interest in people. They stared with unsettling focus at visitors, their eyes dark and penetrating. When adults lied, even harmless lies, they recoiled, turning away as though stung. A farmer once joked that he had finished his chores when he had not. The boys stiffened, glaring until he confessed the truth. The congregation laughed nervously, but Martha did not. She noted the pattern they could not abide: dishonesty. By 18 months they had begun whispering to each other in the same fluid language Ruth had spoken during their birth. It flowed like water, unintelligible yet melodic. They used it only among themselves, but always while staring intently at those around them. To outsiders, it seemed conspiratorial, as if 3 infants were sharing secrets too heavy for human ears. Then came the night that proved beyond doubt that Ruth's prophecy had been true. It was in March of 1857 when bounty hunters once again prowled the county. A family of 4 freedom seekers hid beneath the meeting house. The community gathered upstairs, nervous, whispering prayers. The boys sat on the floor together, eerily calm. When the freedom seekers emerged at dawn, preparing to continue north, one of the men, a strong, able-bodied stranger, insisted on leading the group. Samuel hesitated but agreed. Yet the boys did not move. They locked their gaze upon the man, their faces hard, their bodies trembling. In unison they whispered in their strange tongue, pointing toward him. Their cries erupted only when he tried to take the hand of one of the children in the group. Alarmed, Samuel intervened, demanding to know the truth. Under pressure, The man revealed himself to be a scout for the Garrett brothers, sent to infiltrate escape parties. The family was spared. The spy fled. The boys had unmasked betrayal before it began. From that day, Cedar Mills' reputation grew. Freedom seekers whispered that the town sheltered not only compassionate Quakers, but children with sight beyond reason. The silent triplets, they were called. Guardians who saw what others could not. Conductors altered their routes to pass through Cedar Mills, trusting the boys to discern truth from treachery. But such reliance weighed heavily on the children themselves. By their third year, they rarely played with other young ones. They preferred one another's company, whispering in their river-like tongue, staring with their deep, knowing eyes. Adults grew uneasy in their presence, even honest men and women. For honesty was never perfect. All carried hidden thoughts, jealousies, or private resentments, and the boys seemed to see them all. Even Samuel confessed in his journal, "When they look at me, I feel my heart laid bare. Every unspoken doubt, every moment of weakness, they see it. I do not know if they forgive, or if they only record. I fear to know which. Still, the Quakers continued to shelter them, bound by duty and fear alike." Ruth's prophecy lingered in every mind they will always know, and the question deepened with each passing year. If they already knew so much, what would they become when grown? By the spring of 1858, the boys Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac were 2 years old, and already their presence had reshaped Cedar Mills in ways no one could have imagined. What had begun as quiet care from Martha Whitmore and a handful of families became a kind of watchfulness shared by the entire community. Every household took turns sheltering the triplets, but all spoke of the same peculiar experiences. The children woke in unison, turned their heads together, and reacted with eerie precision to strangers. Martha's journals from that year described the first hints that the boys' abilities extended far beyond the walls of the meeting house. "They sense storms before the sky darkens," she wrote. "They sense quarrels before a word is spoken. They look at me as though they know what I have not yet admitted to myself." One entry, dated May 1858, records how the boys burst into tears without cause. Later that day, word arrived that a conductor guiding fugitives along the Ohio River had been shot dead. Their grief was not of children, Martha observed, but of souls who felt the wound as if it were their own. At first, the community dismissed such accounts as superstition, but the patterns multiplied. Whenever betrayal stalked the network of the Underground Railroad, the boys grew restless. When deception entered the meeting house, they recoiled. It was no longer possible to ignore. Even the most skeptical Quakers began to treat the triplets as sentinels, a kind of living compass pointing toward truth or treachery. Samuel Whitmore himself struggled with the weight of this new reality. A man of faith, he believed all gifts came from God, but these boys unsettled him. He confessed in a letter never meant to be read aloud, "They are neither prophets nor children, but something between. I cannot tell if their presence is a blessing meant to guide us, or a burden meant to test us." The wider world, however, was growing more dangerous by the day. In 1859, the raids of bounty hunters increased. The Garrett brothers, now infamous across southern Ohio, had expanded their network of informants. Rumors spread that they had been paid directly by wealthy planters to cripple the railroad's operations. Every journey became a gamble. Families huddled in basements prayed not only for freedom but for survival. During these perilous months, the triplets' influence reached its peak. When freedom seekers arrived, Samuel no longer relied solely on codes or passwords. He looked to the boys. If they were calm, the group was trusted. If they wailed, precautions were taken. Over 3 years, 7 infiltrators were identified by the children's uncanny awareness. In each case, the danger was real men carrying hidden weapons, spies hired to map routes, and one supposed to conductor later revealed to be selling fugitives back into slavery. But every revelation deepened the unease within Cedar Mills. Quakers, though grateful, felt exposed under the children's gaze. It was not only liars who were revealed. Ordinary falsehoods, small evasions, unspoken doubts, private desires seemed equally visible. One woman confessed that she could not bear to be near the boys after they stared at her during worship. "I felt as though they could see every thought I had ever hidden from my husband," she whispered. By the age of 3, the triplets had developed what the community began to call the knowing look. It was no longer infantile curiosity, but an expression sharp and deliberate. All 3 would turn their heads together, their dark eyes fixed upon a person, as if peeling away their secrets. They whispered to one another in their private tongue, leaving adults trembling. Dr. William Harrison, who had studied them since birth, recorded his most unsettling observations during this period. Their hearing, sight, and reflexes remained normal. He wrote in a letter to a medical colleague. Yet, they consistently demonstrate knowledge no sensory organ should provide. They anticipate footsteps before they are heard. They identify deception without hesitation. Either these children possess an unknown faculty, or I am witnessing a phenomenon for which science has no language. What unsettled Harrison most was the toll it seemed to take on the boys themselves. He noted how they grew solemn, even sorrowful, as though burdened by the very knowledge they carried. They rarely smiled, rarely laughed. While other children played, they sat together in silence. Their small hands intertwined, their eyes far away. The year 1860 brought fresh peril. The election of Abraham Lincoln had inflamed tensions across the nation. Ohio, perched at the edge of freedom and slavery, became a battlefield of informants, bounty hunters, and desperate fugitives. Raids grew frequent. Federal marshals stormed towns without warning, and even trusted conductors found themselves betrayed. It was during this turbulent season that the boys revealed a new, more terrifying aspect of their gift. On a bitter January morning, without warning, all 3 began to cry in unison. Not the cries of hungry children, but a keening wail that seemed to tear through the house. They could not be calmed. For 6 hours they screamed, their voices rising and falling in dreadful harmony. Then, as suddenly as it began, they fell silent, exhausted. 2 days later, news arrived. A group of 11 fugitives had been captured south of Cedar Mills. Among them, a pregnant woman who gave birth during the pursuit. Both she and her newborn perished on the frozen road. The timing of the capture matched the hours of the boys' cries exactly. Samuel tried to dismiss it as coincidence. But when it happened again 3 weeks later, this time corresponding to the murder of a conductor near Portsmouth, he could no longer deny it. The boys were not only perceivers of lies, they were witnesses to suffering at a distance. By now, families seeking freedom begged to pass through Cedar Mills, not for the safety of the tunnels, but for the judgment of the boys. Some believed that if the children blessed them with silence, their journey would end in liberty. If the boys cried, capture was inevitable. Quakers resisted the idea that providence could be measured by infants. Yet quietly they began to believe it too. Martha, ever faithful to her journals, captured the essence of their growing dread. They are not children of laughter, but of knowledge. And knowledge, in their hands, is as heavy as death. The triplets themselves seemed to understand this. They did not revel in their strange power. Rather, they carried it like a burden. They sat together by the fire at night, whispering in Ruth's liquid tongue, their eyes dark pools reflecting things the adults could never see. And in those whispers, though no one understood, there lingered the sense of prophecy, something still to come, something larger than Cedar Mills, larger even than the railroad. By the dawn of 1861, Cedar Mills had changed. It was no longer the quiet Quaker settlement Samuel Whitmore had shepherded for decades. Instead, it had become a strange outpost where faith, fear, and unexplainable phenomena converged. Families traveling the Underground Railroad whispered of the place as if it were a sanctuary guarded not by walls, but by three solemn children whose eyes could pierce deceit itself. The triplets, Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac, were now 4 years old. By all outward appearances, they were small boys with unruly dark hair and the quick steps of youth. Yet no one mistook them for ordinary. They seldom laughed, seldom played with other children. They kept to each other, whispering constantly in that fluid, river-like tongue that no adult understood. More than once, adults described the sensation of walking into a room and finding the three of them seated together in silence, staring with eyes far too old for their years. The townsfolk had begun to avoid their gaze. Even the most righteous men and women carried private doubts, hidden longings, or secret shames. Under the triplets' watchful eyes, those things felt exposed. And while the boys never accused or condemned, the weight of being seen proved unbearable. One neighbor confided, "I would rather face the hounds of the garrets than the eyes of those children. At least the dogs cannot see my thoughts." Yet the Underground Railroad flourished under their shadow. Conductors came to rely on their judgment. 7 infiltrators had been unmasked over the years, sparing countless fugitives from capture or death. Refugees began to ask to pass through Cedar Mills specifically, convinced that if the silent triplets allowed them through, their journey would succeed. The meeting house basement, once merely a station of concealment, became something more a place of supernatural assurance. Still, the gift came with costs. The boys grew increasingly detached. They showed affection for one another, but little for anyone else. Even Martha, who had nurtured them since birth, admitted to her journal, "When they look upon me, it is with pity, as though they know some sorrow that waits for me beyond the years. They are gentle, but they are apart from us." The true extent of their abilities revealed itself in the winter of 1860 on the eve of the Civil War. On a bitter January morning, as the community gathered for worship, the three boys suddenly erupted in cries unlike any they had made before. It was not hunger, not pain. It was a sound of pure terror, a keening wail that reverberated through the wooden walls and brought grown men to tears. For nearly 6 hours, nothing calmed them. Then, as the sun set, they fell silent, eyes fixed southward. Days later, word reached Cedar Mills a group of 11 fugitives had been ambushed 40 miles south. Among them was a woman who gave birth during the chase. She and her child perished from exposure. The timing matched the boys' cries precisely. It happened again. Weeks later, during a quiet supper, the boys froze in unison, their small hands trembling. They began to whisper in Ruth's unknown language, their voices rising and falling like a chant. That same night, a conductor was gunned down outside Portsmouth. Again, the timing was exact. Dr. William Harrison documented these events with growing unease. He measured their pulses, their temperatures, their breath during such episodes. Their bodies respond as one. He wrote, "Their heartbeats synchronize, their temperature drops, and their eyes seem fixed upon some invisible horizon. I am forced to conclude they are perceiving distress not present in this room. What sense allows such a thing? I cannot name," news spread quietly. Families with missing loved ones began arriving in Cedar Mills, begging the boys for answers. Against Samuel's protests, the triplets sometimes approached these grieving parents. They would stand before them, whispering to one another, then speak simple, devastating truths. One such case involved the Brennan family, whose daughter Mary had vanished while traveling to Columbus. After months of searching, they came to Cedar Mills. The boys lined before Mrs. Brennan, their eyes locked upon hers. After minutes of whispered consultation, Isaac stepped forward. "She is alive," he said plainly. "She is southeast, by the river. The man who took her is not who he said he was." Authorities followed the clue and found Mary locked in a cellar on a remote farm. She had been kidnapped by a man posing as a preacher, who confessed to planning to sell her into prostitution. Mary was rescued, along with 2 other young women. The Brennan case cemented the boys' reputation. No longer were they oddities, they were oracles, but oracles are rarely at peace. By now, the triplets had ceased playing altogether. They sat for hours whispering in Ruth's tongue, their faces grave, their eyes reflecting sorrow too deep for childhood. They seemed to feel the weight of every betrayal, every violent act across Ohio and Kentucky. And though their warnings saved lives, they themselves were withering under the burden. Martha wrote in her journal, "They are children who have never been children. They have no laughter, no innocence. They bear griefs not their own, and I fear it will consume them before they are men." Even Samuel, hardened by years of clandestine work, admitted to being unsettled. "We trust them as sentinels," he told the elders. "But perhaps we have placed too heavy a burden on boys who did not choose their gift. They are weary before they are grown, and weary children grow into dangerous men." The Civil War erupted in April 1861, and with it came chaos across Ohio. Union troops marched south. Confederate sympathizers roamed the countryside, and bounty hunters prowled with greater freedom than ever. Cedar Mills braced itself for raids. Yet, in the midst of this turmoil, the boys began to reveal an even more disturbing faculty. They did not simply sense deceit or betrayal. They began to foresee death. It began with a Union soldier named Thomas Caldwell, who stopped at Cedar Mills while traveling home. The boys, upon seeing him, whispered among themselves, their faces grave. When Martha pressed them, Ezra spoke, "He will not reach home. His friend will kill him by the river. 3 days from now." Caldwell laughed, dismissing it. 3 days later, his body was found near a river crossing, murdered by a deserter who had feigned friendship. The prediction proved exact. From that moment, fear spread not only of bounty hunters, but of the boys themselves. To be seen by them was to risk hearing one's fate, and few wished for such knowledge. Even allies grew distant, unwilling to look into those dark, knowing eyes. By the close of 1861, Samuel wrote in his private papers, "They are becoming something apart from us, perhaps apart from humanity itself. What they know protects us. Yes, but it also condemns us. We are naked before them, and none can bear it long. I do not know what they will become, but I fear we shall not recognize them when they are grown." And still the boys whispered to one another in their secret tongue, gazing southward as war consumed the nation, their faces as solemn as prophets who already knew how much blood was yet to come. The year was 1862, and the war that tore the nation apart was creeping ever closer to Ohio. With every month, the state felt less like a safe frontier and more like contested ground. Federal marshals raided homes suspected of harboring fugitives, while bounty hunters moved like wolves through the countryside. Cedar Mills, once obscure, had become a beacon spoken of among both freedom seekers and those who wished to destroy the railroad, and at the center of it all were the triplets. By now, Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac were 6 years old, but they no longer resembled children in spirit. Their bodies were small and frail, but their eyes carried the sorrow of centuries. They still sat shoulder to shoulder, whispering in Ruth's unearthly language, their words flowing like currents. When they turned their heads together, adults fell silent, for everyone in Cedar Mills understood the boys had seen something. The most chilling revelation of that year was their ability to sense death before it came. It had begun with the prediction of Thomas Caldwell's murder the year prior, but by 1862 their foresight had sharpened into something horrifyingly precise. A conductor named James Morrison, who had faithfully served the railroad for years, arrived one spring evening with 12 fugitives in tow. The community rejoiced at his success, but when Morrison entered the meeting house, the boys screamed. It was not the crying of frightened children, but a primal howl that echoed through the wooden beams. They pointed at Morrison, their faces twisted with terror, their voices chanting a single word, "Death, death, death." Samuel was shaken. Morrison was a trusted ally, known for his loyalty. The fugitives he led appeared exhausted but unharmed. Yet the boys' screams would not cease. When Samuel pressed them, they whispered tomorrow night. Miller's Creek. He will call them to the clearing. Men with guns will come. He brings death. Samuel was torn. Could he risk condemning a man who had faithfully guided hundreds to freedom, or could he risk ignoring the warning of children who had never once been wrong in the end? He chose a grim compromise. Morrison would continue his journey, but 2 men would follow in secret. The following night, events unfolded exactly as the boys had foretold. At Miller's Creek, Morrison led the fugitives into an ambush. 7 were slaughtered, 5 were dragged back into slavery. From a distance, Samuel's scouts watched Morrison accept payment from bounty hunters. The betrayal was undeniable. When news reached Cedar Mills, grief consumed the town, yet grief was accompanied by something darker dread. For the boys had seen it all before it happened. Their prophecy had been true, and their screams had been ignored. From that moment forward, the triplets' word became law. No one dared question their visions. Families came to them with desperate questions. Will my son return from war? Will my husband survive the journey north? And the boys, with calm detachment, would answer. Sometimes they spoke of safety. Other times they delivered sentences as cold as the grave. One widow remembered kneeling before them, clutching her hands in prayer, begging to know if her son would return from the Union Army. Caleb looked at her gently and said, "He will die in 2 weeks, struck in the chest." The woman wept, but she did not doubt. And 2 weeks later, word came her son had fallen at Shiloh, killed exactly as foretold. The community began to fear the boys as much as they revered them. They were no longer seen as children, but as oracles of doom. People avoided their gaze, unwilling to learn truths they could not bear. Even their caregivers felt uneasy. Rebecca Whitmore, Martha's daughter, wrote in her diary, "They speak as though death is their companion. They play not, they smile not. When they look at me, it is with pity, as though they know my fate. I love them, yet I cannot stand their eyes." And yet, in their isolation, the boys grew stronger. They began to sense not just individuals but entire battles before they happened. In July, they stood at the meeting house window, staring south. "So many will die," Isaac whispered. Days later, news of the Battle of Bull Run reached Ohio, thousands dead. The Union routed. Their vision was not vague fear, it was precise, timed, and devastating. Dr. William Harrison, the physician who had tracked their development, grew increasingly alarmed. His medical notes from 1862 recorded a terrifying discovery during their prophetic trances. The boys' pulses synchronized, their breathing slowed, and their body temperatures dropped several degrees. "It is as though," he wrote, "their nervous systems are merging into a single organism, perceiving as one." He feared what might happen as they grew older. Would their minds become entirely one consciousness, Would they even remain human in the sense the rest of us are? The burden of their gift was visible upon them. They rarely spoke to others, save in answers to questions. They seldom smiled. Their whispered language grew more constant, as though they found solace only in each other. And yet, when they spoke aloud of their visions, it was with detachment. Death was not tragedy to them, merely inevitability. "Why do you not weep for those who die?" Martha once asked them. Ezra looked at her with solemn eyes. "Because we see them already, even before they pass. We mourn before you do. When they die, we have already grieved." Such words chilled the marrow of all who heard them. These were not the thoughts of children. These were the thoughts of beings who carried knowledge far beyond their years. By the end of 1862, Cedar Mills was suffused with silence. The Underground Railroad still functioned, guided now by the boys' warnings. But the community felt itself under judgment, as though every word, every thought, every sin was laid bare. Samuel confessed privately, "They are no longer ours to raise. They belong to something greater, something darker. They walk among us, but they are apart from us, and we cannot hold them forever." The triplets themselves seemed to know this. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, Isaac spoke softly, almost to himself, "We are not like them. We are not like anyone." And Ezra added, "We will always see what they cannot. And one day, we will have to leave." The year 1863 dawned with blood. The war had reached a fever pitch, and the once quiet lanes of Ohio echoed with the tramp of soldiers, the barking of dogs, and the shouts of bounty hunters emboldened by chaos. Cedar Mills stood like a fragile island in a storm, its Quaker meeting house weathering not only raids and suspicion, but the constant weight of a mystery no one dared speak aloud the three boys who had become something other than children. By now, Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac were 8 years old. Yet they bore little resemblance to ordinary boys. Their limbs were thin, their faces pale, but their eyes had grown darker, deeper, as though reflecting the shadows of everything they had witnessed. They seldom played, seldom smiled, and spoke mostly in their mother's liquid, unknowable tongue. When they did address others, their words were heavy with solemnity, carrying truths no one wanted to hear. The townspeople whispered that the boys had become prophets of death. Their visions no longer concerned only individuals or fugitives. They had begun to foresee battles and massacres with chilling precision. Weeks before the Battle of Shiloh, they sat by the window whispering, then told Martha simply, "A field of red. So many will not return." When news arrived of the slaughter in Tennessee, none dared dismiss their foresight as coincidence again. It was during this year that Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, one of the first female physicians in Ohio, came to Cedar Mills. A determined woman of sharp intellect and unshakable faith in science, Hartwell had heard whispers of the Whitmore journals and of the silent triplets who could perceive things beyond human senses. She arrived under the guise of offering medical care to the Quaker community. But her true purpose was to study the boys. Samuel Whitmore hesitated to allow it. He had grown protective of the children, fearing that discovery would mean their capture by federal or Confederate authorities alike. But Hartwell was persistent, and in the end, Samuel relented, reasoning that perhaps she could explain what none of them could understand. Hartwell's examinations, carried out in secrecy, astonished her. Using the crude instruments of the day galvanometers, tuning forks, and primitive probes, she observed reactions in the boys that defied reason. When one was touched with mild electrical current, the other two flinched as though the charge had passed through them as well. Their heart rates synchronized during moments of concentration. Their brain activity, measured crudely by her instruments, appeared heightened, almost as if the three of them shared a single consciousness spread across three bodies. "They are not three children," she wrote in her private notes. They are one organism, distributed across 3 vessels. Their nervous systems resonate like tuning forks, bound together by some unseen current. What one feels, all feel. What one knows, all know. Hartwell pressed further. She conducted experiments in which volunteers told truths and lies before the boys. Every time a falsehood was spoken, the triplets reacted sometimes with agitation, sometimes with whispered warnings. Hartwell concluded they were not merely reading body language. Rather, they were sensitive to something deeper, the electrical activity of the human brain itself. Her theory was bold, even heretical for its time, that the human nervous system generated electromagnetic fields, and that these boys, through some mutation or alteration, could perceive them directly. Lies, fear, violence, all left patterns in those fields, and the boys could read them as easily as one might read words on a page. But how had such children come to exist? Hartwell sought answers in the past, and she found them in Ruth. The Quakers had preserved Ruth's body in their small cemetery, in accordance with their traditions. With Samuel's reluctant permission, Hartwell examined the remains. What she discovered horrified her. Ruth's tissues bore the scars of mercury, lead, and other industrial poisons commonly used in dye works on Kentucky plantations. These toxins had ravaged her, perhaps even hastened her death, but in her unborn children. They had triggered mutations unlike any seen before. Hartwell realized with dawning terror the triplets were not supernatural. They were the first glimpse of human evolution, forced by suffering and poison. "We are witnessing," she wrote, "a leap in human perception born of misery." These children are the first of something new, but such revelations could not remain secret. Word of Hartwell's note spread quietly among sympathetic colleagues, and before long, others took interest. Union officials, desperate for advantages in the war, heard rumors of children who could detect lies, foresee betrayals, and sense death itself. To men of power, the boys were not a mystery to be studied, they were potential weapons. In February of 1863, federal marshals arrived in Cedar Mills with orders to bring the children to Washington. They claimed the boys' talents could help identify Confederate spies, could save Union lives. But Samuel saw through the ruse. He had worked with enough government men to recognize their hunger for control. They did not want to protect the boys. They wanted to own them. Yet, when Samuel rushed to warn them, he found the triplets already prepared. Their few belongings, small cloth bundles, scraps of paper, a wooden toy carved by Martha were gathered by the door. "We have to leave," Caleb said calmly. "If we stay, bad things will happen to everyone here," Isaac added. "They will not protect us. They will cut us open to see how we work." Ezra, the quietest, whispered the most haunting words of all. "We have seen the world they want to build. A world where people like us are kept in cages." That night, before the marshals reached Cedar Mills, the boys vanished. They disappeared into the labyrinth of caves and forests that lined the Ohio hills. No trace of them was found. Search parties combed the countryside with dogs, but the triplets had melted away as if they had never existed. Before leaving, they made a final revelation to Samuel. "There are others," Isaac said. "Children like us, born in times of violence and poison. They are scattered, but we can feel them. Someday we will find them." Then they were gone. The marshals arrived hours later to an empty meeting house. Furious, they searched every home, but Cedar Mills had nothing to give them. The Quaker family swore they knew nothing of the boys' whereabouts. In truth, none did. The triplets had vanished beyond even their sight. Yet, in the months and years that followed, whispers spread of children in Pennsylvania, in Texas, in California, who displayed strange gifts sensing lies, predicting deaths, finding the lost, always born in times of strife, always carrying the same dark eyes that had once stared through the people of Cedar Mills. The triplets had left, but their legacy had only just begun. By the winter of 1863, whispers of the vanished triplets had spread far beyond Cedar Mills. Though the federal marshals returned to Washington empty-handed, the story of 3 boys who could detect lies and foresee death refused to die, for the Quaker families left behind. Life became a daily act of concealment. They denied all knowledge of the children. Yet their journals and memories told another story: the boys had been real, their powers undeniable, and their disappearance had left the town both relieved and bereft. But for Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, the story did not end with their vanishing. She had spent months observing the children, recording physiological data that could not be explained by conventional science. When the marshals demanded her findings, she hesitated, fearing what might be done if the truth were unleashed. Yet, under threat, she relinquished her notes. Within days, the research was stamped classified and buried in the archives of the War Department. Still, Hartwell retained fragment scraps of observation copied in her own hand. In these, she wrote candidly, "The boys are evidence of forced evolution. They are not angels, nor demons, but victims of chemical corruption visited upon their mother. And yet, what misery produced is also revelation, a human nervous system capable of electromagnetic sensitivity, perceiving lies, deceit, and even distant suffering. They are not prophecy, they are perception." By 1864, rumors reached even the battlefields. Soldiers spoke of strange children glimpsed near rivers or crossroads, children who vanished when approached. Confederate deserters told tales of a trio of pale boys who stared at them with eyes like burning coals. Some said they were ghosts of war. Others swore they were Union spies. No one could prove either claim. In Cedar Mills, Samuel Whitmore grew old beneath the weight of secrets. Though he seldom spoke of the triplets, his private letters reveal a torment that never eased. "We harbored them," he wrote, "but we never understood them. They bore knowledge beyond us, and we bore the guilt of letting them go. I pray they remain hidden, for the world is not gentle with what it does not understand." Martha, too, continued her journaling, though her tone shifted. Where once she had marveled at the boys, now she wrote with sorrow. They were children robbed of childhood. They knew lies before they knew play. They carried grief before they could walk. Perhaps their vanishing was mercy, for the burden they bore was heavier than any soul could carry. Meanwhile, the Civil War raged, and in its shadows more stories emerged. In Kentucky, a slave woman claimed her newborn twins could hear death days before her master's overseer died in an accident. In Pennsylvania, a girl was said to predict fires before they started. In Texas, twin boys could lead their neighbors to missing livestock with uncanny accuracy. Scattered, unconnected, but to those who remembered Ruth's sons, they were signs. The triplets had said there were others, and now it seemed they were right. Dr. Hartwell, though closely monitored, persisted quietly in her research. She corresponded in secret with colleagues in New York and Philadelphia, cloaking her findings in coded language. Variant perception, she called it, avoiding references to the boys. Her clandestine letters reveal her conviction that stress, violence, and toxic exposure could unlock hidden capacities in human biology. "We are not fixed," she wrote. "The species bends under the weight of suffering. The triplets were not the first, and they will not be the last." In Cedar Mills, the Quaker meeting house fell into decline. Without the boys to warn them, the station grew vulnerable. 2 conductors were captured in 1864. One was hanged in Kentucky. Fear spread, and by 1865 the community ceased harboring fugitives. The trapdoor was sealed, the basement abandoned, the once sacred chamber left to dust and silence. Yet the memory of that basement, the place where Ruth had labored in unnatural calm, where 3 infants had lain silent beneath the boots of hunters, remained etched in every mind. Parents warned their children not to play near the meeting house ruins. Some said if one stood there at night, faint whispers could still be heard, like water running over stones. When the war ended, the story of the boys passed into legend. Some said they had fled north to Canada. Others that they had been captured and dissected in secret laboratories. A few swore they still roamed the woods of Ohio, appearing only in times of peril. None of these stories could be proved, yet all carried the same undertone: the world had not seen the last of them. Indeed, decades later, more evidence surfaced. In 1887, a farmer repairing an old barn near Cedar Mills found a scrap of parchment tucked between beams. Written in 3 distinct hands but signed with one name, the children of Ruth, the note read, "We are not gone. We are watching. Our children will be more than we were." The handwriting matched none known in the town. Yet scholars who examined it insisted the script bore remarkable similarity to that of 3 different children taught side by side. The parchment remains one of the few tangible pieces of evidence suggesting the boys survived into adulthood. For Samuel Whitmore, who lived until 1889, the memory of them never faded. His final entry, discovered after his death, captures the haunting paradox of their existence. They were neither miracle nor curse, but revelation. They showed us what the human soul might bear if stripped of innocence. I do not know if their kind will elevate us or destroy us, but I know they are not finished. Somewhere, their eyes are still open, and so the legend of the triplets entered a new phase, not confined to Cedar Mills, not confined to the war, but woven into the fabric of American folklore. To some, they were ghosts. To others, mutants. To the Quakers who had known them, they were children, and that truth was perhaps the most tragic of all. For though they carried knowledge too vast for their years, they had once been babes lying in a mother's arms, silent beneath the footsteps of hunters. And whatever they became afterward, their beginning was carved in blood, poison, and prophecy. By the turn of the century, Cedar Mills was little more than a memory. The meeting house fell to ruin, its trapdoor buried beneath dust and ivy, the once bustling station of the Underground Railroad now silent. The town itself dwindled as the railroad bypassed it, leaving only scattered farmsteads and a cemetery where Ruth's weathered stone leaned against time. But though the place vanished from maps, its secret never fully died. For the story of Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac lingered like a shadow, whispered from parent to child, from journal to rumor. The boys had disappeared in 1863, melting into the wilderness before the marshals could claim them. No one in Cedar Mills saw them again. Yet, across the nation, strange reports began to surface in the decades that followed, reports that bore their mark. In Pennsylvania, a girl born in 1871 predicted a mine collapse that killed dozens. In Texas, twin boys led searchers directly to the body of a missing child. In California, a farmer's son exposed a con man with nothing more than a glance. These stories, scattered and unconnected, all carried the same thread: children burdened with knowledge they should not have. In 1923, workers renovating an abandoned farmhouse near the Ohio River uncovered a hidden trunk sealed beneath the floorboards. Inside were papers astonishing in their implications. One letter, written in 3 distinct hands yet signed as one, declared itself the voice of the children of Cedar Mills. The document traced genealogies, mapped families, and most disturbingly listed predictions. It named events that had not yet occurred when the letter was written: the outbreak of 2 world wars, the testing of an atomic bomb in the desert, and even the year a man would step onto the moon. Each prophecy came true. The letter ended with a promise that was also a warning. We are still here. We are still watching. With each generation, our sight deepens. The world will call us when it is ready, and when it does, we will answer. Scholars dismissed the find as forgery, but locals who read it whispered otherwise. Could the triplets have lived into old age? Could they have left descendants carrying their strange gift? And if so, where were they now? The answers seemed to flicker in and out of history like candlelight. In the 1930s, police officers in Illinois reported a young boy who could detect liars with uncanny precision during interrogations. In the 1950s, a girl in Virginia dreamed of accidents before they occurred, saving her family from a fire. By the late 20th century, neurologists began quietly cataloging cases of what they called electromagnetic sensitivity individuals who claimed to feel the emotions of others or sense deception as physical pain. One researcher, Dr. Sarah Chen of Johns Hopkins University, declared in 2019 that such individuals might number in the thousands across America. They are not psychics, she explained. They are humans whose nervous systems evolved under duress, inheriting traits from ancestors exposed to trauma and toxins. Their lineage may trace back to the 19th century, to the Cedar Mills Triplets. And then came 2003, when yet another discovery pushed the legend into chilling relevance. Renovators of an Ohio farmhouse found a second cache of documents, including another letter written in multiple hands. It carried a simple message: the time is near. When you are ready to know, come to the place of our birth. We will be waiting. On February 23rd, 2024, the 168th anniversary of their birth, more than 50 people gathered at the ruins of Cedar Mills Meeting House. They were researchers, descendants of Quaker families, and individuals who claimed to share the strange abilities once attributed to the boys. What happened that night remains shrouded in secrecy. No official record was made, and those who attended refused to speak. But afterward, several of the attendees began working together on projects involving missing persons and unsolved crimes. Dr. Chen, who was present, offered only this: the legacy of Cedar Mills is not finished. In truth, it is only beginning. What began in a frozen basement in 1856 had rippled forward through generations. 3 boys, born in silence, whose eyes saw truth too clearly, had left their mark not only on a town, but on the trajectory of human history. Were they aberrations, poisoned into existence by chemicals and suffering, or were they harbingers of a new human lineage, one that might one day transform society into a place where lies cannot hide? The question remains unresolved, perhaps even dangerous, for knowledge is seldom gentle, and sight into the human heart is rarely a blessing. As Samuel Whitmore once wrote before his death in 1889, they are not like us, and yet they are of us. If they are the future, then the future will be a mirror that spares no man. And so, the story of the Cedar Mills Triplets closes yet does not end. Somewhere, their descendants may still walk among us. Perhaps they sit silently in classrooms, turning their heads together when deceit passes by. Perhaps they serve in courts, sensing truth and lies beyond evidence. Perhaps they live quietly, burdened by knowledge they never asked to bear. One thing is certain: they are still watching. As Ruth whispered with her dying breath, they will always know. And if the letters are true, the time will come when they will step from the shadows not as children of secrecy, but as heralds of a future humanity never imagined. A future in which no lie, no betrayal, no hidden violence will remain concealed. The question is not whether they exist. The question is whether we are ready for them,